given that Barry is the largest campus in the world with 27,000 acres, probably about 3/4 of it is forested. Some of that is typical pine plantation type forests and other forest types. We happen to have this small relict area that is referred to as Mountain Longleaf. Mountain Longleaf is a part of the longleaf pine ecosystem in general, but it's a rather distinct habitat that's found in northwest Georgia and northeast Alabama. It's quite distinct from the longleaf pine forests that are found throughout the coastal plain, Piedmont, and so forth. So I'm going to introduce this to you, but talk about this particular project, how it got started, what we've been doing, what we actually do on the project, and a little bit about some of the challenges along the way, and talk a little bit about the future, future of things like this, including this particular project. Much of the longleaf pine ecosystem that's left that's intact. This might be a shot from one of the big military bases or a large hunting plantation in South Georgia. Much of it's on the coastal plain, and you see this kind of coastal plain savanna. Primarily longleaf pine in the overstory, and then a huge diversity of understory plants and grasses. One of the most biologically diverse ecosystems in the world. In our area, northwest Georgia, northeast Alabama, we have mountain longleaf pine forests. And Lavender Mountain is a large mountain that goes right across campus. It's large, yes, for Georgia. It's not that large even, but it's about 2,000 feet at the maximum. But it's a forest ridge. And mountain longleaf forests did go down into the valleys, but predominantly they were in south and southwest facing slopes of these ridges, the Ridge Valley, and the upper Piedmont, and even on up, perhaps even some in the upper Plateau. So that's the kind of habitat we're talking about. It's not a distinct species, it's a particular habitat type with a particular characteristic set of species, but it has that similar feature of being dominated by longleaf pine. And I'll try to emphasize all along, where you have old growth longleaf pine, you had fire. Fire is the principal ecosystem modeling factor that is necessary to allow longleaf to persist in a long run. Now, how did this project get started? Actually, a student was working down in the coastal plain and came back and was jogging along and just suddenly saw these longleaf pine, and he thought, this is weird. They're not supposed to be up here in the mountains. So he showed it to us, and we started getting curious about it. We started to census trees in 1999, and then there was some logging going on campus, and students, were not particularly being kept aware of what's going on. They decided, they found out that the logging was due to something called southern pine beetle, which attacks pines like loblolly pine, shortleaf in particular. So they learned that longleaf was resistant. It's resistant to a lot of different things. I'm talking about fire, most of it, also insects and diseases of various kinds. They decided, let's go ahead and plant trees. By that time, I had learned enough about longleaf to know that just planting trees, it's a good thing. I mean, that's a good thing, but as those that are involved in trees and land here probably know, you just plant them and walk away. That doesn't usually work very well. And in particular, in ecosystems like longleaf pine, you have to do more than just planting trees and walking away because of the critical factor of fire. Later on, we had some expansions. I'll talk a little bit about some of this, but eventually my students and I developed a management plan that was accepted by the administration. Now, we have old growth trees. So this is just an example. This is a tree right here. This one dates to 1705. We have stumps like that. What we see here is fire scars. There's a whole series of fire scars. I've highlighted the obvious ones. You can count the number of years between fires. This particular log was burned. There was a fire that came through and lit it enough to get it on fire once every about 10 years or so. And then what happened right here? No more fire. About 60 years. And that's the pattern that we discovered, that these areas where we have these old growth trees had not been burned for probably 60 or 70 years. And they end up looking like this. That's a nice forest. It looks kind of nice, but it's not what I just showed you. You see a lot of fuel build up in the understory. We have virtually no understory plants and grasses. And instead of having the canopy dominated by longleaf pine, we have a bunch of fire-intolerant species coming in and filling in. This is what's referred to as mesophication as a result of the lack of fire suppression. It creates a very dangerous situation, actually, because even though longleaf pine is extremely resistant to fire, once you suppress fire for several decades, it becomes very susceptible to fire. The habitat builds up deep layers of organic material that, once it catches on fire, can ash. What happens in intermediate years? The roots of those trees are growing up into that organic material. That organic material would ordinarily not be there. And if you do have the wildfire that comes around, or the fire that comes into the habitat, those trees, they can survive the fire itself, But for several years later, they become stressed, they end up getting insects, they end up dying out. So they end up being very susceptible to fire as a result of fire suppression. Just to give you an overall perspective here, Longleaf, this is sort of the original right. That's up in southern Virginia and on into these pockets in Texas and down into Florida. And this little bubble right here, this is the Mount Longleaf range, right? Very tall, just about right there. Now, 98% of our forests were eliminated. They think that perhaps the longleaf pine is the most reduced natural ecosystem on the face of the earth. 98% has been lost. And what remains often is in poor condition, like it was on Berry College. It was in poor condition because of fire suppression. Martha Berry was a great forester. She was actually the president of the Forestry Association way back in the 1930s. But the mantra at the time was fire is bad, fire is bad, fire is bad. So she established, by the 1940s, she had a very effective fire control program at Berry College. Students ran out and put out any fire that came through. Longleaf casts a lot of needles and big cones and a big thick bark that sloughs off, so it really builds up around them in particular. In that situation, you also have this problem of possibilities as well as opportunities. So most of that mountain, the Longleaf Mountain, had never been plowed. Lather Mountain, not Longleaf Mountain. Maybe I'll rename it that. Most of that mountain was never plowed, so that means that recovery of a lot of that understory that looks like it's lost is actually possible through refugia, plants found here or there, or seed reserves, seed bank. Other pine beetle and wildfires were common actually problems. They were nipped in the bud as much as possible. Southern pine beetle by cutting down swaths of forest. Wildfires by running out and put fire breaks around as soon as you can and all that sort of thing. But they're really a problem mostly in longline shortleaf plantations. Longleaf is a more stable source because it's more resistant to fire, insects, and disease. Both of these are sort of opportunities that this is going on. This creates opportunities to be able to put longleaf back in these areas. The context of being on a college campus means that we have all these opportunities to engage the public, engage students, research, service learning opportunities. In any case, as far as what we were faced with when we decided we were going to try to tackle this problem was that kind of situation. This is really excessive fuel buildup. If you know anything about what's going on now in this nation, a lot of what we hear about is climate change. And climate change is increasing the probability and problems associated with wildfire. Right? We know that that's true. A lot of it has also to do with decades and decades of fire suppression that leave fuels building up like this. Now, I mentioned to you that wildfires can happen and the trees can die as a result of the duff storm, and that's exactly what happened. This was a very nice longleaf pine stand. Fire suppressed for many decades. A wildfire got in there. It crept down the hill. There was a slope here, and it ashed that duff completely away. And me not knowing the real full story at the time, I walked back in there and went, great, the project is jump-started, The trees look great, everything. We got fire in here, even though we didn't do it on purpose. It was a wildfire. Little by little, over the next couple of years, nearly all of those trees died. About 10% of them made it through. We learned from that experience right away that just throwing fire back on the landscape without any regard for anything is not a good idea. We're going to reintroduce fire as a part of our restoration program. We had to do something to deal with that excessive fuel buildup. This is just a map. This is from the last really big outbreak we had. It's actually almost 20 years ago now. This is from the late 1800s, and it shows a map of the range of longleaf. This is commercially timberable longleaf. I want you to notice this is all the coastal plain, and then these little pockets up here, there's a number on there. Those numbers indicate the same board foot per acre or whatever. These pockets out west, I'll show you pictures of those. Those are unbelievably fantastic. The point that I'm making about it is even though these were geographically not large areas, within those areas they were substantial longleaf pine stands. From our perspective, they were still expansive areas. They have this grass stage. The seeds tend to germinate predominantly on relatively bare soil. That's best. Think about when would you find bare soil in a forest? Often after a fire, right? They have this grass stage. They persist in this grass stage for a good number of years. This grass stage is very fire resistant. The bud is kind of buried down in those needles. The needles are full of moisture. The fire comes through. It's like they just, as long as that bud stays alive, stays cool enough, just sprouts right back. They begin to grow, and they have this phase we call the rocket phase, or juvenile phase, teenager phase, where they're suddenly shooting up. That phase is also an adaptation of fire, because what they're doing is they spend years building a giant taproot. They use the resources in that taproot to just shoot up. And they're trying to get themselves through the hottest part of the fire. And the hottest part of the fire is usually about this far off the ground. So they're shooting their growing bud up as fast as possible so that they're out of danger. Only at that point do they start to make side branches. This is very different than all the other pines that we have. They start making side branches immediately. Then ultimately, when they age and get to be reproductive adults, they can live, they're the longest lived of all the pines, up to 500 years. And they develop very thick bark, a lot of needle cast. The thick bark protects them from damage from fire. They're very fire resistant. And that needle cast is one of the things that accentuates the flammability of the habitat, because you have a lot of this fine fuel that flitters down, and it's kind of fine fuel makes for nice, even, fast-moving fires that carry through the habitat. The natural sources of fire, lightning strikes, certainly. Those tended to happen early in March in the past, and then in October when it starts to dry up. But Native Americans, and even the post-1830 settlers, European settlers might have used fire more frequently than the Native Americans did. Crop management and that sort of thing, just letting fires go, just accidentally. We're not just talking about a tree, so that, yes, I am so far talking about a tree, but many species, many of the plant species have similar adaptations to the fire, and other adaptations. A lot of people ask me, is longleaf the kind of thing that, the cones open in response to fire? No, that's called serotinous cone production. It doesn't do that, right? It just opens cones, it drops whenever it produces cones. But there are plant species that will flower in response to fire. Seeds will germinate as a result of being exposed to fire. There's lots of different adaptations that native plants that are associated with this community have that are also adaptations to fire. And many of those species, the kinds of species, were lost over time as the habitat was fire suppressed. Fire also kills hardwoods and other competitors. Longleaf likes to have its full canopy exposed to the sun. That's where it does best. So even if you get a cluster, this is a cluster, this is early on, a cluster of seedlings, they don't do well if they're not fully exposed to light. They look a little wilty to you, there's something going on there. Fire kills competitors, competing species. That little longleaf pine there, it's perfectly fine. It's about 40 feet tall right now. Why did the tree decline if the ecosystem as a whole declined? Well, some of it's the typical things. Replacement with faster growing trees, shorter rotation. Fire suppression predating Smoky Bear. That really creates a scary notion, doesn't it? It's like death in the eyes of the forest. And it's funny because I'm running around all the time giving these kinds of talks saying, fire, it's revitalizing the forest. It's helping the forest, but it's not the attitude at the time. There were lots of people, particularly here in the South, using fire, practicing fire management as part of their culture and part of just what they did. And it seemed to the Northerners that that's not acceptable. There was a lot of sort of re-education programs trying to teach them how to manage their forests, and it was all from the perspective of experiences in northern forests. Same thing in California and other places like that, where fire suppression was just the mantra everywhere. It really wasn't until the 60s or 70s that things started to change. My fact is all these suppressed the system down to about 2% of the original range. This is one of those Texas forests. Isn't that amazing? I don't know any place that looks like that. That's what it looked like afterwards. Made those trees susceptible to fire. Faces will light up. I call those cat faces. Light up and catch on fire, and it weakens the tree. It's all about forest, that all forest fires are bad, but the big changing message, it's been a while now. It's been a good 30 years that many organizations, everything from the typical that you might think about foresters interested in commercial forestry, all the way to organizations like the Nature Conservancy, and understand the importance of fire in these natural systems that have evolved. So the changing message is from forest fires to preventing wildfires. We have an area that we've been working with. It's roughly 400 acres. What we wanted to try to do is reproduce what would be typical in old growth, fire-maintained ecosystem. The thing that I really didn't emphasize is that there were virtually no longleaf seedlings. There was almost no trees less than about 60 or 70 years old, indicating that during the period of fire suppression, there were no new babies coming into the population. So we wanted to have a stable population where they're replacing themselves, different age classes. We wanted to reduce those hazardous fuels. We wanted to increase the abundance of the native herbs and grasses. We did develop targets. There's one place, really only one place, that's mountain longleaf habitat that has been frequently burned. It was on Old Fort McClellan over in Alabama. It's called the Mountain Longleaf Pine National wildlife refuge. It was a bombing range. It would be regularly burned, sometimes even burned more than once a year. It's the only known place that has been continuously seen fire through all 1800s. So what we can do is compare the vegetation composition for structure of this site that's to our site. Use that as a target. Similar plant community, similar forest structure. The first thing that actually happened was they started to plant. Again, planting students did the first actual action themselves. We began restoration burning in those old growth areas, and the plan was to try to burn every 3 to 5 years. And that's what our best guesstimate of was the natural fire return frequency. We began to control hardwoods and invasives through direct removal or with work herbicides. And this is the only thing we really use herbicides for, is to try to directly target, particularly invasives, try to accelerate the rate of recovery by getting rid of some of the fire-tolerant rock particles. So these are things that would have fallen out anyway. We're just taking them out a little bit sooner so we can get that understory recovered sooner. We also were concerned about not having a source of trees for restoration. There's only one seed source for Mount Longleaf pine. It's from one site in Alabama. So we began to try to address this problem. Now we have 18-acre seed orchards with predominantly Berry College material. Basic footprint to start the project, at least. This area here we call our core management area right here, with most of our old growth stands. The lighter areas over here were burned, the darker areas not burned. We have some reference stands of various kinds. These are southern pine beetle clear cuts. We planted longleaf in there and then began to do prescribed burning in those locations. So this was the footprint of the project as it was started. Recently, we've been able to begin to really expand upon this. There's been probably about 600 acres of longleaf planted in the last few years. And this next year, there'll be another 600 acres. But we are expanding on a project at Berry College. Lots of different people, students from outside organizations like the Georgia Forestry Commission, Nature Conservancy, Georgia DNR. School groups helped out. We did a lot of research, planning. Forestry and land resources helped us a lot. We plant using plugs. These are some plugs that we grew ourselves. People like to plant trees. It's the other stuff that's more difficult. And we focused on where we were doing this, what we call low-density conservation planting. So the idea is we didn't want to plant trees so close that within 10 years or so that we have a closed canopy. We wanted to try to maintain an open canopy the entire time. Planting densities are a lot lower than you typically see in a commercial forestry plantation. And we planted in a random pattern. This is a clear-cut area, and that's about 5 years later. I mentioned that we had this fuel buildup, 60 or 70 years of fuel buildup, and you got this problem. What are you going to do? Well, burning at the right weather conditions, that's part of it. You burn when it's been a really wet period, and then you just have a couple of days of drying, and then burn a small amount of the fuel off the top, and come back and do it again in a couple of years. We also decided to try raking around our trees. We did this pretty successfully. That's one of the advantages of being at a school like Berry. I could give my Bio 111 students that happen to fail that first exam, hey, you want some bonus points? Come on out, help. So a lot of raking. So the raking actually was really effective. We didn't know how well it would work, but here's like a pre-burn example and post-burn example. So that worked out pretty well. And most of the areas have been burned 3 or 4 times since. We actually engage students in this. We don't just hire it out or that sort of thing. So I train students each year. They're trained to guidelines that the U.S. Forest Service would employ. We can't do it without our Forestry and Land Resources Department. We couldn't just do it ourselves. Solid controlled fire, prescribed burn is probably better, because if you do the prescription right, it will work out right. If you follow the rules that you established. Georgia has a rule that the fire has to be completely out by nightfall. So that kind of limits the size of the unit that you can burn at one time.
How long is 100 acres?
It'll take about 5 or 6 hours. We generally get started about 10 a.m. You have to wait till the humidity falls to below 50%. And you want to have a window between 25% and 50%. Somewhere in there is like a sweet spot. So just some shots sort of showing before and after. Aesthetically pleasing, yes. Just after about 10 years that we've been working. What you can see here is we've been able to maintain a good proportion of that canopy. Almost continuous understory. That's the grasses. Not just grasses, but also wildflowers of various kinds. This is another couple of shots showing old growth, flat top. The old growth trees, they get up to a certain height and they don't get any taller. Instead, they form these real kind of crookedy, thick-limbed things call them all flat tops. We've done a lot of quantification of all this sort of stuff. So, for example, the understory plants and grasses went from about 14 different species we could identify to something like 150, 160. It's a tenfold increase in the number of species. We did a little herb study. I don't want to focus too much on that. We did only what we needed to do, and the concept is that once we've done that, prescribed burning should handle any issues from that point forward. Here's another example of before and after kind of thing. Here we have the same habitat. You see the old growth trees up here above everything else. And then this really thick understory coming in below. These are all fire intolerant hardwoods for the most part. Hickories of various kinds. Very common that they're fire intolerant. You opened up the understory. Sometimes longleaf pine forests are referred to as upside down forests, tropical rainforests, where much of the diversity is at the very top of the canopy. Longleaf pine forests, the diversity is actually the forest floor, like the upside down forest. We did these seed orchards. Seed orchards are done in two different ways. We did some grafting. Why would we graft longleaf pine? That scion is from a 200-year-old tree. So you graft it on a seedling in an orchard setting, and within a year or two it's making cones. Plant a seedling in the ground, you might wait 20, 25 years to get cones. The reason we did grafted orchards to start off with was to try to get early cone production. The other thing is getting cones off of trees. This is me pretending to try to reach one of those with a pruning pole. And this is a 30-foot pruning pole, and I'm not even at the lower branches. So I get cones, we use a giant slingshot, 8-foot tall slingshot, shoot a thin line, a fishing line up, and then we pull a rope up, and then we just shake the tree like hell. And we have our hard hats on at the time because those cones are this big and pretty heavy. This is one of our seedling-based seed orchards. So all of these were grown from seeds. They're nice and tall, straight trees, but they haven't produced cones yet. These are about 10 years old. We've tried to study things all along. I haven't generated tremendous numbers of publications because that wasn't really my main incentive here. I have lots of different areas of research that I publish in. The primary idea here was to do research that actually assisted the project. Every couple of years, I got my forest ecology group in on some problem that they could work together to solve, give us some information, inform the project. So much of the work that we did was really to inform management decisions. We also have a lot of other organizations from the outside that have come on campus and done working on all the time. The vegetation here is now very much approaching that of our target community. It's very similar. We have similar structure, similar species diversity. Hazardous fuels have been substantially reduced. Those deep organic layers are essentially gone. We increased bird abundance. Bird abundances increased 50%, and there's a shift towards the type of birds that were there. What were there typically? Those that you might expect in Mesic, hardwood-dominated forests, a lot of omnivores and canopy nesters and so forth, and it's shifted to a lot of foliage and ground and shrub nesting species and things that were, you might expect. It had positive effects on reptile amphibian diversity in the first few years of the project. A lot of public education and outreach, lots of service and learning opportunities, lots of school groups came out to help or learn. Thank you very much.
Can you put the picture with the fire starting back at the beginning?
Yeah.
Why was it all on one side of the tree?
Once a scar is formed, that's the point at which it will light up again. So there's usually sap, there's some dead wood, some damaged material. So that's the spot that will typically reignite. It goes out, it doesn't kill the tree, and it heals over, and it happens again.
Are there any, just off the top of your head, species that you noticed in the understory that jump out at you?
I published a paper on a sort of a characteristic understory species of the Mount Longleaf ecosystem. I was trying to look at across different habitats and see how ours compared. Some of them, for example, is the world coreopsis. We have anthropogon grasses. We don't have the wire grasses like you might have heard in the coastal plain. We don't have wire grasses. We have various blue stems, big blue stem, little blue stem.
Do you see the same types of life diversity that we do in the coastal plain?
It's not as diverse. So it's not as diverse. And there aren't as many threatened species, rare species. Probably one of the species that a lot of people know about is what you might have heard like indigo snake or gopher tortoise or red cockaded woodpecker. Indigo snake and gopher tortoise, no. Red cockaded woodpecker, yes. That does occur in Mount Longleaf areas. And as the crow flies, probably about 50 miles away from our campus is a really well-developed area associated with Pullman Lake in Talladega National Forest. They put in artificial nest boxes for birds there, and then they're building their own colonies, spreading really good recovery project over there. So we don't have enough area. I cannot find any evidence of holes. As far as plants go, the plants tend to have very similar characteristics. They tend to have thin leaves, they tend to like acidic, dry, well-drained soils. They just have similar habitat characteristics. They have this assemblage of species that are found in this location. But they're found in other spots as well. So there's not this unique, that something that a plant that's only found in Mount Longleaf. There really isn't. It's not like that.
How many different species of longleaf? Or is it all the same?
Depends on your definition of what a species is. The forest geneticists say it's all one species. Right? So we're not talking about a distinct Mount Longleaf species. That said, there's population differentiation. There's differences in the longleaf that are found up in the mountains from the typical coastal plain longleaf. And there's things that we presume that are different. For example, the things that we know that are different. They have somewhat shorter needles, smaller cones. They reproduce cones a little more frequently. Things that we suspect must be true is things like frost tolerance, freezing tolerance, ice storm tolerance, more resistance to wind throw because of the habitat that they're in. And that's population differentiation. That's what breed readily with the others. Yes, of course, it's all one species. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak.